Well, a very good evening. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to the Blavatnik School of Government, particularly if you're new to the institution. My name's Tom Simpson, and I'm one of the faculty members here. And so I was previously a member of the British military, a serving officer with the Royal Marines Commandos, which for much of my time in academia, my colleagues have viewed as at best a sort of slightly idiosyncratic kind of part of my background. And obviously, in the last 3 weeks or so, we've just been transfixed by the images of war on the edge of Europe, in Ukraine. And suddenly, my background became something that was actually very relevant to current affairs. So what tonight is really, I'm going to do two things that that's my aim for tonight. So the first is particularly aimed at those of you who don't have much experience of the military, to try and give you a sense of how military people think about the situation that is unfolding on the ground in Ukraine. And as part of that, to try and chart out what are the potential military trajectories that the battlefield may take. And then the second aim is I want to zoom out from that, and I want to think about what are the potential political implications of how the battlefield is unfolding. So in the abstract, I mentioned the famous quote from Carl von Clausewitz, who was the Prussian theorist of war, who said that war is the continuation of politics by other means. But the direction of influence isn't just from politics to war, it is also from war back up to politics. So we're going to go through some of the ways that this conflict can end, and we're going to try and explore what to look out for to see where different scenarios may end up, and also try and think about which ones are more probable and which ones are less probable. Okay, so that's the plan for the time we've got. So, as you'll all be aware, the campaign started in a way with a version of shock and awe. So the quite clearly understood intent now, it's quite clearly understood now that the intent of the initial Russian invasion was a decapitation strategy, or a coup de main. So the aim was to seize Kiev as quickly as possible, ideally kill Zelensky, capture him, or send him fleeing. Any of those options would be acceptable. And then when you've got control of Kiev, you can effectively dictate terms politically. And the thought is you might just see the whole country fall like dominoes from there. Just a picture on the slide. This is Russian paratroopers who arrived at 8 o'clock on the morning of February the 24th in Hostomel Airport, which is just to the northwest of Kiev. About 34 helicopters with 300 paratroopers in them. Some helicopter losses on the way in, so some reports say 3, some reports say 6 to 7. But this was initially rebuffed. And you may have seen this bit of footage as well from this. So this was a CNN reporter who went to Hostomel Airport, and that is Russian paratroopers. He was literally just taking footage from there. And there was footage of, very dramatic footage of some gun battles taking place there. But this was rebuffed. Okay, so the Ukrainians moved in, they recaptured Hostomel on that same day. There were some Spetsnaz attempts to go into the center of Kiev. They were also rebuffed in the same day. And crucially, Ukrainian forces did not collapse in a panic. So when military people think about combat power, they will often distinguish between 3 elements of combat power. So the 3 elements are physical power, conceptual power, and moral power. Okay. So the physical power is how much stuff you have, how many tanks you have, how many aircraft, how many soldiers you have. And it can be measured reasonably precisely. Conceptual power is, do you know what to do with this stuff? Okay. How effectively can you bring this to bear? And the third element is, if you like, the moral dimension of conflict. How much do people want to win this battle? And you'll all have seen graphics like this in the newspaper. So this is drawn from the Telegraph and British daily newspaper, and it just gives graphic illustration of the relative sizes of the Russian military as against the Ukrainian military. And when you tie that up, it looks like this is just going to be a one-sided contest where the bigger force walks over the littler force. But the picture that we've seen emerging is much, much more complicated than that on the ground. So firstly, Russian combat power looked very impressive, but it actually highlighted serious weaknesses. So the conscript military, in particular, was not expecting to fight. So this is one of the consequences of the failures of public information in Russia, the centralized decision-making in the Kremlin with Putin and a very small handful of people. The military surprised a lot of them as they went over the border. And the conscript element adds to this. So these are individuals, 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, who've been called up. Potentially a third of the Russian military might be conscript. And they just did not expect to fight. They didn't think this is what would be asked of them. And one indication of this is we've seen a series of high-ranking generals, potentially 5 major generals, so that's 2-star figures. We've had 1 lieutenant general, that's a 3-star. And by comparison, the highest ranking officer that Britain lost during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was a lieutenant colonel. So there's 3 ranks discrepancy. Now, the reason for this is that as an officer, if the men are reluctant to fight, what you have to do is you have to go forward and you have to say, come on, let's get in the fight. And you're trying to push people to try and lead by example. So the ability for the Ukrainians to kill this number of senior general officers in the Russian military, one of the possible indicators of that, explanations of that, is that the Russian senior figures needed to be far forward to encourage the Russians to fight. So the will to fight is very seriously missing. Napoleon, you might have heard the phrase, Napoleon said, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. Okay? So he thought it was a 3-to-1 ratio. The implication of that being a numerically inferior force who wanted to fight might be able to defeat a force that was 3 times its size. And the physical dimension again is much less impressive than it might look on the graphics. So this is a website which you can see that if you just type in Oryx, I think it will then either come up or fill it up. And what Oryx does is it tracks all the verified bits of materiel, aircrafts, tanks, etc., that have been destroyed. And it provides a link. So this is someone who's taken a photo on the battlefield, and there's some kind of, you can identify where it is, or you can identify the serial number. Now, so what this gives is a conservative estimate of the number of tanks that have been destroyed. What we can't really infer from this is whether the Ukrainians are losing more than the Russians or vice versa. But we can see relative differences in the age of the bits of equipment that are being put out. So in the yellow, what I've highlighted there are T-64s, T-72s. So these are legacy bits of kit, really from the 70s and 80s. And that's been the predominant majority of combat losses on the battlefield from the Russians. And just down here at the bottom, in purple and actually just slightly below the purple, you have the T-80s, more modern, and very, very few T-90s. So the Russian military, which is supposed to have gone through this big modernization program in the last 10, 15 years, that is not showing through on the battlefield in terms of the quality of armor that is being represented. Okay. And a final comment just about the sort of size of the combat power that we've seen in the Ukraine. By one analysis, we've seen 55% of Russian army, deployable combat forces, deployed into Ukraine. Okay, 55%. Another estimate actually puts it at 60%. Now, contrast that with the US in 2003. So in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the US used 24% of their deployable combat power. That is a really significant difference. So if you've got 24% of your combat power, what you can do is you can send your troops in, they can fight for 6 months, and you can pull them out, and they've got 18 months at home to recuperate, just recover, see their families, get ready, and then go again. And you can sustain that indefinitely. You can just roll on, roll on. If you've got 55 or 60%, your troops have got 6 months in the field, and then they're coming out, and then less than 6 months later, they need to go back out onto the battlefield. So you can see immediately that is a recipe for exhaustion for the Russian military. So this is why we're now getting reports of effectively Putin calling in urgent reinforcements from all the different allies that he can possibly use. So we've had reports and evidence of Chechens on the battlefield, Libyans, Syrians, and the Wagner Group private military company. So this is a desperate attempt to generate more forces to make the campaign sustainable. Okay. What about Ukraine? So again, on the graphic, their numbers look a lot less, but they've had some really decisive bits of kit. So this is a video, many of you will have heard of the Javelin missile system. And I just want to display a video. This is from a test firing of the Javelin, and to show you why it's so significant. So just to watch out for, it goes relatively quickly. So there are two features that I'd encourage you to look out for. So the first is the launch of this bit of kit. So it's a two-stage launch. What happens is, if I was here, pull the trigger, it kind of pops out, and then very quickly after that, a secondary motor ignites, and it climbs up, okay? And then the second element is it comes in for what's called a top attack down on top of a tank. So this is the effect of it. Americans test firing. Okay, so you may have seen footage of, there was a very famous photo that's come out of the conflict of a turret of a T-72, I think it was, just lying in the snow somewhere on the side of a road. You've probably seen images of that. Okay, that's quite likely to be a Javelin strike. It comes in and it blows the whole thing apart, and the turret's just literally blown off, and it'll be found 50 meters away from the tank. Okay, so why do those two features matter? The secondary ignition matters because you can fire it from inside a building. Okay, so if it was a single ignition, the blast wave from that would kill the person who was operating it. But with a double ignition, you can launch it, it'll pop out the window, take off from there. Okay, so that's the first bit, so you can use it in urban combat. The second significance of top attack is you're attacking the tank at its weakest point of armor, and you also create a 360-degree battlefield. So tanks have heavy armor at the front, modest armor at the side, very little at the back, very little at the front. So if you've got a lighter system, you're needing to try to maneuver at least to hit it on the side, or even potentially at the rear of the tank. But hitting it on the front is not much good, it just kind of bounces off. The Javelin you can take on a tank from any angle. Okay, so the Javelin is a really decisive bit of kit. And the N-Law, you'll also have heard of this about the N-Law. So Britain's really lent in to supplying the N-Law. The UK's supplied over 4,000, I think it's 4,700 systems to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians, as they use it, the soldiers apparently say, "God save the Queen," as the missile fires. So my royalist heart rejoices at that. So I'm going to play just a clip of the N-Law. Again, this is training, just sort of practice firing. And the thing to watch out for, again, this is a triple phase ignition. So there's an initial launch, there's a secondary ignition which takes it, and then as it passes over the top of the tank, another explosion detonates and sends a projectile down, which then kills the tank. So watch out for all three of those elements. And the video has about 3 or 4 firings, just in quick succession. So that's the secondary ignition. Okay. So, and again, the N-Law is a really significant bit of kit for taking out armour. Okay, but as well as decisive bits of kit, there's also been, the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can use their kit in a very powerful and effective way. So the conceptual element of their combat power has been significant. And I think this may well reflect NATO training missions since 2014. So what I'm going to show now, just to illustrate this, this is a photo. This is actually from the same CNN report that I showed about Hostomel Airport. And I've just taken a screenshot here just to show you the system that you can see on the right-hand side just there is the anti-armor system that the Russian soldiers are using. And this is a second-generation anti-tank missile. So this is effectively line of sight, and it's guided as it goes. So it's a much more primitive bit of kit. It doesn't have nearly the same killing power that the Javelin does. Okay, I'm going to show you another video to demonstrate the integration that the Ukrainians are achieving. So this is what I've put here, because the video kind of moves quite quickly. This is just to prepare you so you can see what to look for. Okay, in the top left, the video starts off with imagery of someone. It's a camera, probably worn on their chest, and he's driving past two vehicles on the left and right, which are static, bombed out, drives along, and then he pulls in to the side. Okay. Then it cuts, and we see drone footage of this Russian vehicle, a KAMAZ truck, driving along the road. Then we cut again to the footage filmed again from the chest, and this Ukrainian soldier who launches not a very sophisticated anti-tank weapon, a lighter one, but an anti-materiel weapon. And then it cuts back to the drone footage, and we see the moment of impact on the truck, and the truck carries on. So just, if anyone's viewing this online with children, there's nothing graphic in this, but it is a scene of actual combat, so just be aware of that. You may want to take children away. Okay. So I've stripped out the sound. The sound had like a banging soundtrack, okay, like a sort of, there was a beat to get the audience excited. So he pulls aside, you can just see the yellow house on the top right, just there, the road sign, and he's just pulling into this residential street. So this is the Russian truck now coming along the same, so it's the same street that he's just driven along. Coming up to a junction, you can just see the yellow house there. So he raises it up now. So he's in ambush. Okay, that's the moment of impact. Okay, just to get the propaganda value, they replay it twice, and then the truck kind of carries on. So something's happened. The doors come off. The driver is probably dazed. Much beyond that, who knows? Okay, and that's the end of it. Okay, so I just want to pick out a couple of things from this video. So the first thing to say is that this is very definitely, this is information operations we've been subjected to. So this is an attempt by Ukrainian armed forces to portray their forces in the best possible light. So whenever there's so much stuff out there on social media, and you need to be skeptical as you look at it. You need to be continually asking the question, whose agenda is being served? Could this be faked? I think this is probably realistic, probably real footage. Okay, but there are two other things to point out. Okay, so the first thing is, this was an opportunistic attack on a road that was used jointly by Ukrainian and Russian forces in the region of Kharkiv. Okay, what that says is that the conflict is a fluid one, okay? So it's almost more like insurgency than it is ground holding that you might associate with World War I. So it's not like the Russians control this bit, they fight, they move a bit forward, they fight, they move a bit forward. There are places in Ukraine which are like that. But here, the conflict is much more, there are Russians moving down the roads to go and try and resupply at the front, reinforce the front, and there are Ukrainians in the fields or the houses around, and they're able to interdict an ambush and take action there. Okay, so it illustrates the fluid nature of the conflict. And the second feature of that is that it illustrates air-ground coordination. So what's probably happened there is the drone controller has said, we've got a lone Russian truck, anyone in the area who can then take this on. And this guy, it's actually probably from the Azov battalion, the far-right battalion, that have been working with, that are part of the Ukrainian, actually, National Guard in the east. They've said, yeah, I can do this. He's dashed into position and taken it on. So it's air-ground coordination. And this is something that the Russians have really struggled to achieve by comparison. So, for instance, Russian pilots have been taking off in the air with GPS coordinates for where they're supposed to drop the bombs, okay? So there could be 20 minutes, 30 minutes of travel time from liftoff to dropping bombs, okay? So you've got no tight coordination between what's going on the ground and then what's taking place militarily. Okay, so let me just, for reasons of time, let me just jump on ahead to a couple of projections for where this is going to go. So just very quickly, this is what the Russians are doing. The Russians are responding. So this is a video from the Hostomel airport operation. So they're responding in terms of their information operations. They're trying to get more imagery out to say, look how well we're doing on the ground. And this is a troop-carrying helicopter coming in with its payload of parachutes.
Нормально. Уходит, налево уходи. Он видит, да, все нормально.
Okay. So the Russians are already beginning to respond to the information battle that is taking place. Okay, so what's the future? I'll just jump that. So this is what's called a javelin cage at the top. So they're trying to protect their tanks against these top attack systems. That's not going to be a very effective defense. But let me just run through the way the invasion has developed. So this is a map of Ukraine. What we've done here, what the tech team have very kindly done, is taken a daily updated map from a think tank in America called the Institute for the Study of War, who've become the leading open source repository of analysis of the war. And what this provides us with is an ability to see visually how the invasion has unfolded in the different parts of the country. So what you've got here is the two places where the Russian invasion has been had most impact is the northern area around here. So it reached Kiev relatively swiftly and has stalled there. And then there's been the advance from the northeast coming towards Kiev to try and encircle the capital city. The other major area of progress, perhaps the most important area for reasons I'll explain, is down here in the south coming out of Crimea. And this has been a relatively diffuse push. So coming up north, some forces have headed east, and we now have the surrounding of Mariupol, the city on the coast. We've had some forces coming north towards Zaporizhia, and there was the nuclear plant around there that was captured. And then other forces have sought to come around, try and go past Mykolaiv, and then towards Odessa, the principal port city of Ukraine. So I just want to say, at the moment, the reporting you're getting about Russia suggests that the invasion has stalled, okay, and it's probably not going to go anywhere. Does that reflect, is that the sort of sense you're getting? Okay, right now, that is true. Okay, right now, Russia has kind of reached a point where it's unable to advance more significantly. It would be a mistake, in my view, to infer from that therefore Russian victory on the battlefield or significant Russian gains on the battlefield is an impossibility. So Russian efforts so far have been characterized by poor planning. And you might think, okay, well, what's going to change at this stage? But there is a possibility that they can pull themselves together, they can learn. War is a huge learning environment. It forces people to you don't want your people to die, is the short of it. So what have we got to do to make sure our fortunes change on the battlefield? And there are, in particular, there are available strategies for Russia. So this is a map of the language distribution across Ukraine. And what you get is a sense of the significance of the east of Ukraine and the degree of Russian-speaking peoples there are. So this is always going to be the natural heart of where Russia are trying to go and take control of Ukraine. And you then have some other elements of the geography of Ukraine. So Ukraine is cut right down the middle by the Dnieper River, just here. And what I've highlighted is the key areas where you can cross the Dnieper River. So Kherson down here is already controlled by the Russians. That's also where the freshwater supply for Crimea is controlled. Zaporizhia and Dnipro, these two key cities, sit astride a key strategic choke point on the river. You then have two very small crossings here, another crossing here, Kremenchuk, and then Kiev. Okay, why does this matter? If the Russians really put their minds to it, one available strategy is to close off the Dnipro River. Okay? If you close off the Dnieper River, what happens? All the forces on the eastern side can't be resupplied. Okay? The Ukrainian Air Force doesn't have the capacity to resupply the east. So what you have is an envelopment strategy which is available to the Russian forces. And they're hovering around here. They've got a lot of forces tied up in Mariupol. If Mariupol falls, they can then reuse those forces. And what you might then look at, so this is Mariupol. Mariupol, who knows how long they'll hang out, okay? It could be a few days, it could be a few weeks. This is inherently difficult to predict. But in the event that Mariupol falls, that releases a lot of forces to head north, okay? So what you have is envelopment strategies available to Russia. So they could try and envelop across there, or they could envelop all the way along across the Dnieper River. Whether they can do this is a different matter, but it is an available strategy which they could seek to do. And if they were successful in it, it would have very significant implications for the Ukrainian military. Okay, so the Russians have reason for optimism about how the fight might develop for them. The Ukrainians also have reasons for optimism because they've fought the Russians to a standstill successfully so far, at least in their, they've successfully harried, and there are areas where they've made local counterattacks, so Mykolaiv most recently. Okay, so that's the military picture. We're in a kind of deadlock right now. Let me move on to phase two. How will this end? So what are the scenarios? So the two very simple scenarios. We could have a Russian battlefield victory, and so that could have happened in the first 72 hours, and the political consequence of that would have been a puppet government installed, or potentially the partition of Ukraine. So one report that I've heard suggested there was a Russian plan to partition the country into 6 kind of mini countries, effectively destroy it as a cohesive power. A second alternative is that there could be Ukrainian battlefield victory, and the consequence of that would be sovereignty is restored. Okay, but what about this middle scenario? What if we had indecisive engagements on the battlefield? The current scenario plays out for weeks, for months, who knows? And I want to suggest that there are 5 different endpoints that that scenario may lead to. So here are the scenarios. One is that we could have a frozen conflict. So what I mean by this is that we have 2 sides who are still in a state of war, but who have stabilized front lines across which the forces look at each other, they might snipe at each other, there might be artillery exchanges across that area. So you'd have a danger zone on both sides of it, but there would be a stability about that conflict. And this is, in effect, what we had in the Donbass and Luhansk for the period 2014 to 2022. It's also what the Kashmir situation is. We have a frozen conflict there in Kashmir between India and Pakistan. Okay, another outcome would be enduring conflict. So we might have Russian control over some significant area, and inside that we would then have an active insurgency seeking to contest control. And the timescale for that is very open-ended. So we had a 20-year insurgency in Afghanistan, which only ended because of the unilateral withdrawal, in particular by the US. A third scenario, we might have what I'm calling a desperate act by Putin. So in a bid to break the deadlock militarily, Putin could instruct to be used tactical nuclear weapons or chemical weapons on the battlefield. Fourthly, we could have a diplomatic solution. So there could be a series of negotiations which lead to a treaty document, an agreement being signed, which recognizes a set of claims which both parties are able to agree to, and which is the price of peace. Or fifthly, we could have leadership change in Moscow. Okay, so that's conceptually, it's another possibility. Right, so what I'm going to do, I want you to tell me the answer as to what you think. Okay, so if you've got a device, if you haven't got a device in the room, my apologies, maybe confer with someone who has got a device. If you have got a device, please go to slido.com and you can enter that number. And you've then got those seven possibilities, Ukrainian victory, Russian victory, and the 5 that I've just listed there. And I'd like you to rank them, please, in what you think the order of likelihood is, from the most likely to the least likely. For those who are joining online, you're very welcome to do this as well. Okay, if you've done that, do just look up so I know. AV team, how many results have we got in, if you want to bring them up? Right, great. Okay, interesting. Okay, that is very good. So that is the group mind. That is the hive mind at work. Fascinating. Just AV team, can we just screen capture that? Just make sure that we've got it on record. So that'd be really interesting. Okay, so this is very similar to my assessment. What I'm going to do is talk through. If we can go back to the PowerPoint slides now, talk through. I'll give you my ranking. So it's just my assessment, and then we can work through some of the reasons for that. So I think frozen conflict at the top is the most likely. With enduring conflict, I think a kind of close second. And the key question that we're going to examine is how these rank in relation to a diplomatic solution. And then further on down, the probability is lower. Okay, so I've suggested, I mean, let me start from the bottom and then work up. So Russian victory, I mean, the prospects of Russia gaining control of the whole of Ukraine just look astonishingly unlikely right now, just given the combat forces they have available and the success of the Ukrainian military. I mean, that is something very unusual would have to happen there. Conversely, the odds of a straight-up Ukrainian victory also looks unlikely right now, I would say. What they haven't demonstrated is that they have the mass to conduct major counteroffensives against Russia. So what they can do is they can interdict supply lines, they can lead to local surrenders, small convoys being captured, but overall they've lacked that demonstrated ability to push back Russia. Okay, leadership change in Moscow. So I'm not a Kremlin watcher, but what the consistent reporting coming out from those who do is that there are negligible centers of political power around Putin and which might displace him. And in effect, the trajectory of the last 15 years or so has been the removal of power from the oligarchs, in particular the Yeltsin-era oligarchs, replacement with oligarchs who are really in Putin's pocket, but the real decision-making power being exercised by what are sometimes known as the Siloviki, the men of force, okay, KGB-era friends of Putin, ruthless individuals, and who would have the power, it is suggested, to turn against Putin. If they all got their minds together and thought, what Putin's doing is contrary to our interests, they could act against him. But their interests seem to be nearly identical to Putin's. Okay? So long as Putin doesn't alienate them, he looks like he's pretty secure. And the prospects of a popular revolt in Moscow probably look more remote than they did 2 years ago, for instance. Now, I don't think we have any leading indicators for this. So if this was about to happen, I don't think we'd be getting much sense of something going on. I think it would just happen, and it would be revealed that something had happened, that Putin had been displaced, quietly moved on, and someone else was in charge. But there is a possible future there where that happens, and that would give the space for a new leader to basically say, I'm really sorry, we didn't mean it. Can we just go back to where we were before? But the odds are low. Okay, the odds of a desperate act. Okay, I think the odds of a desperate act are unfortunately higher than is comfortable. So war has an inherently escalatory dynamic, that once you've committed a certain amount of forces, once a certain amount of casualties of your own people have died, you're psychologically committed, you feel that the anger rises, you need to see this through. And there's also a dynamic whereby the route to success in war is through targeting what is sometimes called the center of gravity. So the kind of the fulcrum point around which everything else turns. And that center of gravity is, for the Ukrainians, they can't contest the Russian center of gravity because that center of gravity is the political will and the military reinforcement from the rest of Russia. So Ukraine is effectively in a passive position where it just has to defend itself against Russian will. Where is the Ukrainian center of gravity? Well, it might be the civilian population. It might be the will to resist. A key element of it might be their support, the military support from wider NATO forces. All of that, how do you target that? That's very, very difficult to do. And so tactical nuclear weapons would be a very, very clear escalation on Putin's part. He has also had, at each stage of this conflict, the escalatory momentum. So at each stage, there have been decisions by, in particular, Western leaders to self-constrain for very understandable reasons in order to ensure that the conflict doesn't escalate beyond its borders, to ensure that we don't end up in World War III. But the consequence of that self-restraint has been that Putin has stepped in and escalated. So 2 examples of this are in the lead up to the invasion, where both the US and the UK said, we will not send troops onto the ground in Ukraine. Okay, that may well have been the decision. It didn't need to be said. Okay, the consequence of saying so is effectively green lighting to Putin to then invade. Okay, a second element was the attempted transfer of MiG fighter jets from Poland to the Ukrainians. That decision was a confused one. There was obviously poor communication going on. And America was kind of spotlighted and effectively had to say publicly, we won't accept these MiGs. And the reason for doing so is because that would be too much of an escalation in terms of the level of military equipment that was being put The moment that was done, the Russians then came in and said, okay, and we now view this as escalatory. So we view the supply of javelins, of Sting as escalatory. So at each step along the way, Putin has had this escalatory momentum. And the discourse around what is Putin's mental state in the West right now actually leads into this, okay? So that the suggestion that Putin may be mad or not thinking properly actually enhances his freedom to act in an escalatory manner. Now, what to do about it is then a very, very difficult question. So in the event that nuclear weapons were used, or potentially chemical weapons, more likely chemical weapons, there'd be a very profound dilemma, in particular for NATO, which would be do nothing beyond what we're already doing, or would the decision be that the consequences of this are so terrible for humanity that we must intervene now to kind of re-establish a taboo on nuclear weapons and chemical weapons use. And that would be NATO engaging in war, in conflict, within the boundaries of Ukraine with Russia. And there's a model for how that campaign might play out. The model is, in effect, the air campaigns in the former Yugoslavia, 1995, 1999. So you might see the US Air Force not only imposing a no-fly zone, but interdicting Russian forces on the ground with Ukrainian, in close support of Ukrainian troops. But to describe that as a high-wire act would be understating the seriousness of that situation. I mean, that would be an extremely, extremely volatile situation. Nonetheless, it is a profound dilemma that would be faced at that point. Okay, what are the leading indicators that this might be a situation that we'd end up in? We are likely to hear chatter in the Russian media or from Russian spokespeople about nuclear threats coming from NATO or chemical threats that they've discovered on the ground or discovery of labs. Okay, that would be one key leading indicator, and we've had that already at various times, the start of the campaign, sort of early March period, and even just more recently in the last 48 hours. I think it may be some time before Russia feels like they would need to resort to these systems because they know that there's an inherent volatility in the future direction of the conflict if they were to do so. But nonetheless, that remains a deadlock-breaking possibility at some point in the future. And another leading indicator, the US is also reported to have quite a well-developed intelligence monitoring system for the deployment of nuclear weapons by Russia. So Russia has raised their combat forces to, I think they call it special combat readiness, but the nuclear weapons are within their silos, within the bases. So the deployment beyond those bases would be a key step, and we'll definitely hear about that in the reporting. Okay. So the odds of that are higher than is comfortable, but I think remains low. So let's really move to come towards the close. What's the odds of a diplomatic solution as contrasted with a frozen conflict or an enduring conflict? And the key question here is there a diplomatic solution which is better for both participants than what they think they can achieve on the battlefield? Okay, that's the question. So if they think that there's a diplomatic solution available which improves their situation relative to that on the battlefield, then there's an incentive to go forward. So we need to look at both. We need to look at the war aims of both Russia and of Ukraine. Now, there are some specifics of what a potential agreement might look like. And you may have picked up on the chatter. There's been various bits of chatter in the last 24 hours, in the last week or so, talk about a 15-point peace plan. The most recent mood music was pessimistic just today. It was optimistic yesterday. But let's try and think through structurally what's at stake. So one of the key Russian war aims is for what's sometimes called a strategic buffer. It's near abroad. And Ukrainian neutrality would guarantee this. So what Ukrainian neutrality would consist in is change to the constitution so that there's no aspiration to join NATO, forswearing of EU membership, and no foreign bases, military bases, on its territory. And Zelensky has already indicated that these are acceptable. It's actually a very significant concession that he's made towards this. Language policy in the Donbass and Luhansk has been an area of contention, part of the Russian case for war in the lead-up. That's something that is eminently up for negotiation. The hard problems are, in particular, the status of Luhansk and the Donbass, because it's very difficult for the Ukraine to formally recognize either their independence or Russia control over them without, in effect, granting to Russia success in the invasion. Crimea may be a done deal. Even Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, doesn't support its return to Ukraine. Okay. Now, so that is a very significant pill for the Ukrainians to swallow, surrendering control, sovereignty over that region. The problem for Russia is that militarily it is already better off now in terms of the territory that it controls than the 2014 to 2022 status quo. So the question that Russia faces is, why would it accept an agreement that returned it to a worse position? And it will do so only if the military costs are impossibly high. So here's my best attempt at threading the eye of the needle of a negotiated settlement. I think the best attempt would be some kind of self-governance or autonomy for the two regions, Luhansk and Donbass, within the context of a federal structure within Ukraine. So there'd be, in effect, complete autonomy on domestic policy for these two regions, with Ukraine retaining, with Kiev retaining overall control of foreign policy, for instance, and anything external to the country. This will be a return to what's called Minsk II, which was the agreement in 2015 which sought to resolve the 2014 flare-up. But Russia, I think, would not accept only that. Russia would make a push. If Russia could have Russian peacekeepers stationed on that territory, I think they would accept that. And I think that's probably a red line for Ukraine. I think that would not be acceptable. So the question then would become, could there be some arrangement whereby there was a third party who provided peacekeepers, monitors, who would guarantee the autonomy of those two regions within an overarching Ukrainian structure? And I don't know the answer as to whether that would be acceptable to Russia, but that is the best opportunity, as far as I can see, as to whether we can thread the camel through the eye of the needle. And the other key dimension, so I'm just backing up. Ukraine's other key question, so one question is sovereignty that it faces. Another question that it faces is, how do we know that Russia is not going to try this again in 5 years' time? Okay. So whatever the settlement is for Ukraine, it has to be one that gives them sufficient assurance that they're not going to be vulnerable to the same attack at some point in the future. One possible source of that is a collective security guarantee from NATO, but it's already on the table that that is not available. So the only source of security that the Ukrainians have is their own army. So Ukraine, it would be completely irrational for Ukraine to sign an agreement which either reduced their military forces, And because their military forces are ultimately their only guarantor of their security, they successfully deter Russia only by being willing to fight. And if they're willing to fight in the future, why not be willing to fight now? So the only reason for stopping is that as a country, they're completely exhausted. So for Ukraine as well, it's not obvious that a diplomatic solution, which involves the surrender of this principle of territorial integrity, national sovereignty, is preferable to a frozen conflict or an enduring conflict. So long as they're willing to fight, my supposition is that they will carry on fighting. And so what are the leading indicators here? So there's a few leading indicators. What might be a sign that Russia is prepared to go for a frozen conflict is going to be a reorientation of its forces. So we might see it pulling back forces from exposed positions, reconstituting them. So, you've got Battle Group A and Battle Group B, both taken heavy hits. So you put them together again and form one intact battle group. So you reconstitute your battle group, and then you move it round, and you reorientate your forces so that you have a defensible front line, and you've basically gobbled off a bit of territory from Ukraine. And I think Russia politically would be able to go back and say, we carried out a special military operation, we took this chunk of terrain, we've protected Russian speakers from genocide, so-called, obviously fictional, but they can say that rhetorically into the domestic market. And that would count as a win for them. And that's preferable from the Russian perspective. So leading indicators will be rebalancing of forces, reorientation to try and make a kind of defensible position. I think another leading indicator that Russia thinks it can win is its attempt to generate more combat power. So one indicator here will be there's a draft about to take place in this spring where more 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds are called up. Actually, incidentally, the Russian defense minister just in the last 2 days signed an order saying that their cadets, 17 to 18-year-olds, can now be deployed to Ukraine. So that's an indication of how desperate they are. But one indication will be the quickest way to generate more forces is to accept the incoming draft, conscript draft, and then the existing one who are fighting now say, okay, you had 12 months service, you thought you were about to go back home, but actually your contract has been extended to 24 months. Okay, the draft has been extended. So that'd be the quickest way for Russia to generate more combat forces. So that will be another indicator to look for in the coming 2 months or so as to whether Russia thinks it has the combat power to win. Okay, so that's the frozen conflict. What about on negotiations? So leading indicators for negotiations will be changing the venue in which it's taken place. So the venue at the moment has been Belarus. Belarus is an aligned power, so it would be like Israel and Iran negotiating, and negotiations taking place with an Iran affiliate, just over the border or something like that. So, it needs to be a neutral place. It needs to be a neutral place. Another sign that negotiations are getting serious is if the US becomes a direct party to the negotiations. And the reason for that is that another of Russia's war aims now is economic survival. So Russia will want to tie in the release of economic sanctions into whatever the deal is that could be signed. And we actually face potentially a situation which has the potential to be tragic, whereby US and Western interests more generally may diverge from Ukraine's interests. So far, the US and the West more generally has been in lockstep with Zelensky in terms of providing military aid. Not provided as much as they want, but we've been politically united. There is a scenario where Ukraine might decide that the price of peace was worth paying. Okay? So they might decide the price of recognizing Luhansk and Donbass was worth paying for the sake of peace, so that their country isn't destroyed, so that their co-citizens aren't killed. Okay? In that eventuality, it may be that the West thinks what's at stake in this invasion is so significant, we need to seek to retain Russia as a pariah state. We need to undermine its government to the greatest extent possible. There's been no kind of apology or recognition of the wrong that's been done in the war and aggression, and therefore will maintain sanctions. So one of the questions to look for a potential end of the conflict is, as there's public statements about what the conditions are under which economic sanctions would be lifted, and that's very unclear. Okay, so that's me. So there are 7 scenarios. We're in tragic days. It's there's considerable uncertainty. If anyone tells you they know what's going to happen, they're lying. No one knows what's going to happen. There's huge volatility in the scenario. But hopefully what I've tried to do is pick out what some of the factors are that might lead us to think that certain outcomes are more likely than other possible ones. So let me finish there. We've got 5 minutes till the end of the scheduled time. It may be that people want to ask a bit more. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to put out now, or comments or observations? There's quite a few online. So let me come to the back. So let me take the two of you together, please. So gentleman in the white top, and then I'll go to Gilbert.
Right. Thank you very much for speaking to us. My question is about the first 3 likely scenarios you lie in there. I wonder, do you think the Russian forces would push into Kiev and essentially do what they've done in Mariupol or in Grozny or in Aleppo before they sort of froze the conflict or engaged in diplomatic solutions? And is there any way to really stop them from going in with, thermobaric weapons or, bunker busting weapons and clearing it out that way?
Yeah, good. So, so Russia would be in a strong negotiating position if it had control of Kiev, absolutely. I think at the moment most military observers assess that they don't have the combat power to take Kiev through city-to-city fighting, sort of street-by-street fighting, urban fighting, because it's a big city, and urban fighting is very, very costly. All that being said, there is a scenario where, so in the past, so 3 examples of urban combat in the past: Grozny 1994, Aleppo 2016, Mosul 2017. And timeframe, so it was about 2 months for Grozny, and Grozny was basically laid waste, reduced to rubble. Aleppo was also very significantly damaged. What made the decisive difference in Aleppo was chlorine barrel bombs. So the significance of chlorine there is that defenders, even when a city's been hit very heavily, defenders can retreat underground and then pop up as the combat troops try and roll over. Chlorine is heavier than air, so it seeps into the underground and either kills people there or forces them up. So there absolutely is a scenario where a desperate act is an attempt to break the deadlock in urban combat. I suppose one of the things I was trying to suggest in terms of potential Russian courses of action, so it's very difficult to tell what's going on, and the Russians may not even know what's going on themselves in their own headquarters. Like, it's been so kind of chaotic and difficult to get a sense of what the campaign plan is. But what I've been trying to suggest is there is a campaign plan where cities are marginal to Russian success. And so apart from Mariupol, there's been no really serious attempt to take a city. They've effectively bypassed them. And in effect, if you can control access to a lot of cities, then you have the prospect of winning the war slowly. It might take a very long time. You might need to effectively, you might let food through, or you supply food from Russia. So there's a semblance of civilian life, but the military is starved of ammunition. The Ukrainian military gradually run out of ammunition over an extended period of time, and that is a scenario that you could see. So I think it's urban fighting is a very real possibility. It would be very destructive. There'd be use of thermobaric weapons. But I think we shouldn't become fixated on that as the most likely course of action. There are other courses of action available. Yeah, thanks. Gilbert.
Thanks so much, Tom, for your analysis. I think I agree with the picture that you have painted. My question is, you talked about Russia's center of gravity, but I think we're aware that in maneuverist approach warfare, you don't attack the strength. You try as much as possible to avoid the strength and then exploit the weakness. What, in your view, is Russia's critical vulnerability in this conflict, and whether if Ukraine would exploit that vulnerability, it would give it its military advantage? Second and lastly is there have been, I think, reports, and I'm not so sure how credible they are, for the past 2 days about Zelensky camping on the opposition in Ukraine, including merging media houses. What do you think could be the impact on the cohesion that we have seen, I think, for the past 3 weeks in Ukraine, and whether that move would also affect the political terrain within Ukraine? So those 2 questions.
Great, thanks. So I also have heard those reports that opposition parties have been prohibited from acting for a certain period, and I don't know the detail of the politics in Ukraine to say whether that's a reasoned response to people who are actively trying to promote, politically a pro-Russian line, which in a sense is an inevitable consequence of all war campaigns, or whether it's actually indicative of a quite concerning illiberal tendency. But I definitely think we shouldn't be starry-eyed about Ukraine. So they've had a very successful influence campaign on us for this period. If you go on Twitter, it's just full of videos applauding the virtues of Ukrainian soldiers, and without doubt, very many have fought very heroically, and they're subject to an unjust invasion. So, and with all that said, it's, one of the reasons it hasn't joined the EU over a prolonged period is because of corruption in its politics. So I think we need to be very clear-eyed about Ukraine. Yeah, in terms of Russia's centre of gravity, so I think in military terms, the kind of fragility of decision-making is likely to be one of the, so a kind of top-down hierarchical method of decision-making is going to be one of its key vulnerabilities. And what we do now have is, it's public that there's US sharing of intelligence with Ukraine. And in fact, I think a key CIA figure went out yesterday or 2 days ago to say it's the best tactical intelligence sharing he's seen in 35 years. And the Ukrainians also have a high-value target hunting team. So there are two dimensions as to why so many senior generals have been killed. One is that they're forward, trying to motivate their troops. The other is that there's signals intercepts leading to Ukrainians targeting these senior figures. And so, because the Russian military is very dependent on leadership, on senior leadership, it's top-heavy, targeting that is a key central gravity. Yeah, but there'll be other possible, focal points as well. Great. Let's get some other questions. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
All right, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but was it inevitable that after Crimea was annexed that this was going to happen? And why wasn't the West stronger in its reaction back then?
So I'm reluctant to say anything's inevitable. I think there are, history can branch in all sorts of ways. I think it's no accident that this has happened 6 months or so after the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So there was very clear, I think the perception, the global perception was of very significant weakness and a kind of vacuum of will at the heart of, in particular, America, a kind of withdrawal from international engagements. Now, the reason for that withdrawal is obviously 20 years of history and the complexity of those overseas engagements, particularly in the Middle East. But nonetheless, that perception has fed into the possibility of this happening now. I think, the only, the kind of, there's a macro debate going on, which I would say is unresolved, about what the pathways should have been in terms of handling Ukraine. And there's the realist argument associated with John Mearsheimer, which says Russia has a legitimate security interest, or at least an understandable security interest, and the West should basically just stay away from Ukraine as a result. It's regarded as a core security interest. So that's one side. And the other side says, no countries are free to make their own decision, and Ukraine, its political direction of travel is greater alignment with Europe, and now the crucial lesson is don't try and straddle both. If you've got a foot on the boat and a foot on the shore, things end badly. Like, you've got to stick with one or the other. So you either get out of Ukraine and just say, this is Russia's sphere of influence, or you invest properly. And so I think the failure to kind of supply Ukraine with military equipment would be a kind of important factor in that. But there's also there's an urgency about Putin at the moment. There's a willingness to take risks and gamble, which I think makes simplistic answers to that difficult. To, if someone wants to have a war, if they regard that as a core interest, okay, your decision is, am I willing to meet that escalation? And in this context, that means the US allied forces saying we're prepared to fight Russia. That's a big shout, a very big shout. Yeah, great. So over here, please. Yeah.
Hi. Could you speak about the position of humanitarian aid and the refugee crisis and the possibility of refugees coming back, given, let's say, the first two scenarios that you see?
The first two of the most likely scenarios, so frozen conflict or, yeah, in a sense, this is outside of my expertise, and clearly there's colossal humanitarian suffering taking place in Ukraine right now, and a frozen conflict. So we've already seen Russia, in effect, saying you can flee the fighting so long as you go east. So that's either within Ukraine or elsewhere within Russia. And we're seeing relocation of civilians, forcible relocation to resettlement in towns across Russia. So that's, that doesn't bode, I wouldn't want to be forcibly resettled. That's a bad thing. But there's no question that civilians are being used as a kind of as leverage by the Russian forces on the ground. So Ukrainians are having to make the very hard decision as to whether you flee west and get out of the way in time, or whether you stay at home and see what happens with the conflict. And actually, I mean, the history here is it's very, very similar to Germany in late 1944, early 1945, where you had very many German civilians fleeing the Red Army, the Soviet army coming east, because that was the Eastern Front was a terrible front in terms of wartime atrocities both ways, whereas the Western Front was relatively, I mean, all war has atrocities, but relatively speaking, was more benign. So civilians were making the decision to, they could sort of see what was going to happen, and they wanted to be in a zone controlled by American, British, French troops in the future, as opposed to Soviet troops. So we may see something like that. Yeah. Okay. Should we take just maybe the last question, and then we'll finish? Yeah.
It's a question on the economic sanctions and what Zelensky has actually the power to negotiate over. Are these sort of independent from his tools and his toolkit to end the conflict, or can they be tied to an outcome, a military end of the military conflict? And I guess then the second question would be, if he is able to sort of release all of those sanctions, to what degree does that send a message to Russia that they can do this again?
Yeah. Okay. So obviously Zelensky, these are not levers that he has in his hands directly. He's reliant on, others have imposed them, and he'll be reliant on their willingness to unimpose them. There is a course of action where those who've imposed the sanctions say to Zelensky, this is now a lever in your hands, and if effectively hand over the decision-making authority, and that would empower him tremendously in the negotiations. He'd be acting from a position of strength. Conversely, there is an argument that says actually we want to reserve the power to render Russia a pariah state. The consequences of this are such that they cannot just be brushed under the carpet. So it would be a big decision to hand over those powers. I think, Russia was dismissive about the threat of sanctions in advance of the invasion. And I think the political direction of travel is one in which they would discount quite heavily the impact of sanctions in the future. So I think this Ukraine's future security depends on hard power. It depends on the military primarily. I mean, there's an incentive obviously as well. So there was just an anecdote about Putin that I came across yesterday when he was, I think he was mayor. I can't remember if he was mayor or deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in the early 90s, and his first wife was in a serious car crash. And he had some quite busy day, some couple of important meetings, and he either phoned the hospital or they phoned him, or he went in to see the doctors, and he asked how she was, and they said, oh, well, she's got this damage, broken leg, she's been smashed around a bit in the car crash, but she will be fine. He said, okay, well, thanks, and then got back to work. Didn't go and see her. So this is not a man who feels emotion very strongly, and is not particularly concerned for the impact of his actions on others. So I think we should be very careful about not overestimating the impacts of what we're doing. Yeah, great. Thank you very much for the questions and the contributions and attending it, and I really hope that's thought-provoking. And can I just also add, there's on Thursday, on the economic side, there's a panel event here at the Blavatnik School looking at the economic consequences of the sanctions regime in Russia. So if you want to know more on that, do come to that. But have a great evening. Thank you.